Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Answers on Eschatology. My name is Dan Derry, and I'm the president of the Institute of Fulfilled Eschatology. Hey, we're in the middle of a verse-by-verse study of Matthew chapter 24, and I want to share some more thoughts on verse 30 with you this evening. So, specifically, we've been looking at the phrase, "Then they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory." And what I want to do in this video is I want to go back to Daniel 7, because that's exactly where Jesus is quoting from, obviously. And I want to show you from the context, the themes, and the constituent elements in Daniel 7 that prophecy is being worked out in Matthew 24. Let me say it like this. The New Testament last days from 30 to 70 AD, the time period covering Matthew 24, is the outworking of Daniel's prophecy in Daniel chapter 7, at least the outworking of the time when the little horn persecutes the saints, and the Son of Man comes in vindication of those saints to establish his kingdom, etc. Now, like I said, what I want to do is I want to compare those two texts, Daniel 7, Matthew 24, and this will show us that, number one, Daniel 7 was not fulfilled at Pentecost. It was not fulfilled at the Ascension. It pointed forward to the destruction of Jerusalem and the coming of the Lord in finality, his second coming in AD 70. And because it did, Matthew 24:30 also speaks and prophesied of the second coming of Jesus Christ to consummate all things in AD 70. So let's do this. Go with me to Daniel 7 and Matthew 24. You're going to hold open your Bible or a Bible in a computer, two different areas. I'm going to go back and forth between Daniel 7 and Matthew 24 and show you the identical elements of both texts, placing these both texts at the same time period. Watch this. Daniel 7 and verses 21 to 25. Daniel 7, the first element we're going to look at is the persecution of the saints, okay? So here's the point. Remember, we're talking about the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. So in Daniel 7, the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven of 7, 13, and 14 is in the context and the framework of all these elements, okay? Daniel 7 and verses 21 and then 25. Watch this. I kept looking, and that horn was waging war with the saints. Verse 25, and he will speak out against the Most High, that is the little horn, and wear down the saints of the highest one, and he will intend and make alterations in times and in the law, and they will be given into his hand for times, and half a time. So in Daniel 7, verses 21 and 25, we have the persecution of the saints by the little horn. Go with me to Matthew chapter 24. Watch this. Matthew 24, we have the persecution of the saints. First, Matthew 23 begins this. Jesus speaks to the Sanhedrin, to the scribes and Pharisees of his generation, and says that all the blood of all the righteous shed upon the earth will come upon it. They would be held guilty of that blood, and judgment would come upon in their generation. Why? For the persecution of the saints. He continues that theme in Matthew chapter 24, verses 9 to 13. Let me just read 9 for time's sake. And they will deliver you to persecution, sort of tribulation, and will kill you, and you'll be hated by all nations for my name's sake. That's the persecution of the saints in Matthew 24. Back to Daniel 7. Second element that we're going to look at is the judgment of the little horn. So the little horn in Daniel 7 persecutes the saints, and in that context, that little horn is judged for that persecution. And we see that in verses 11, Daniel 7:11, I'm going to read that. Then I kept looking because of the sound of the boastful words of which the horn was speaking, and I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body destroyed and given to the burning fire. Verse 22, watch this. Until the Ancient of Days came and judgment was passed in favor of the saints of the highest one. That's in the context of the little horn overcoming the saints, wearing the saints down. The Lord comes, the Ancient of Days comes and passes judgment on that little horn. And finally, in verse 26, we see this again. But the court will sit for judgment, and his dominion, that's the dominion of the little horn, will be taken away, annihilated, and destroyed forever. So we have the judgment of the little horn, the persecutor of the saints, and Daniel 7. Well, go with me to Matthew 24 and watch what we have. In verse 29, remember, in symbolic, metaphorical language, we have the judgment of the persecutor of the saints, which is Old Covenant Jerusalem. We have the falling of the stars, the darkening of the sun, the moon not shedding its light. That's metaphoric language for Israel's destruction. Now, in Luke 21, which is the parallel text to Matthew 24, we have this more explicit. Luke says regarding Jerusalem, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, recognize that its desolation is near. Luke 21:20, in verse 22, he says, because these are the days of vengeance, that all things written will be fulfilled. And then there will be wrath, great wrath upon this people. Luke 21:23. And again, that is in the context of the persecution of the saints. The Lord takes vengeance upon the persecutors. But in Matthew 24 and Luke 21, the persecutors of the saints are the Jews of Jesus's generation. The persecutors of the saints in Daniel 7 is the little horn. Just connect the dots. Okay, back to Daniel 7. Let's look at the next element that we parallel in Matthew 24. The next element is the coming of the Son of Man. Obviously, that is in Daniel 7, 13 and 14. And again, we find that in verse 22. Just let me read Daniel 7, 22. It says, until the Ancient of Days came and judgment was passed in favor of the saints of the highest one. So we have the coming of the Son of Man in judgment of the little horn who was persecuting the saints. Well, we have that in Matthew 24, verse 30. That's the text we're looking at. The Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. That's the coming of the Son of Man in judgment of the persecutors of the saints, the Jews, for their persecution of the saints. Perfect parallels. And the last one, second last one we'll look at, Daniel chapter 7. This is the context at the time when the little horn persecutes the saints. The little horn is judged at the coming of the Son of Man. That's the time when the saints receive the kingdom. Notice in Daniel 7:22. Until the Ancient of Days came and judgment was passed in favor of the saints of the highest one, and the time arrived when the saints took possession of the kingdom. And again in 27, then the sovereignty and dominion of the greatness of all the kingdoms under the whole heaven will be given to the people of the saints of the highest one. Daniel 7 places the time of the receiving of the kingdom by the saints when the little horn who had persecuted the saints was judged at the coming of the Son of Man. Matthew 24. We have the time of the establishment of the kingdom. We don't have that explicitly in Matthew 24, but once again, go to Luke 21. In the same context of the persecution of the saints, of the judgment of Old Covenant Israel, who is the persecutors of the saints, at the coming of the Son of Man, Luke 21:27, we have the saints receiving the kingdom. Jesus said in Matthew 21 and 31, when you see all these things happening, know that the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And in verse 32, he said, this generation won't pass away until all these things take place. Which brings me to my last parallel. Daniel 7, it's at the time of the fourth beast. Everybody admits that the fourth beast was the Roman Empire. Matthew 24, we have the fulfillment of all those elements, the same elements in Daniel 7, in Jesus' generation. And guess what? Obviously, Rome ruled in Jesus' generation. That was Daniel's fourth beast. So we have perfect thematic constituent elements, parallel elements in Daniel 7 and Matthew 24. In both of those texts, we have the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds of heaven at the time when the saints were persecuted. Okay? Daniel 7, the persecution's at the hands of the little horn. Matthew 27, that persecution is at the hands of Old Covenant Israel. And when the saints are persecuted at the coming of the Son of Man, the persecutors of those saints are judged. And when they are judged, the saints receive the kingdom. Listen, what this means is Daniel 7 is Matthew chapter 24. Not just in verses 30 and verses 13 and 14, the coming of the Son of Man. The whole theme and framework is completely, perfectly parallel. That means that Daniel 7 is not an ascension text. It didn't prophesy the day of Pentecost. It prophesied the judgment of Old Covenant Jerusalem as the little horn of Daniel 7 at the coming of the Son of Man at the time when the saints received the kingdom. And that took place according to Jesus in Matthew 24 and Luke 21 and Mark 13 and a host of other texts in Jesus' generation at the fall of Jerusalem, at the old covenant, the end of the old covenant age. That is powerful stuff. That's definitive stuff, guys. And I hope that is a blessing. We'll see you next time. We got lots more to say on on Matthew 24 and the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. We'll see you next time on Answers on Eschatology.